Hello, hello. Welcome to this abbreviated YouTube lecture on Frederick Schaeffer's Elucidating Social Science Concepts. First thing, I am not here to really summarize the entire book. I think Schaeffer does that well within the book. It's only 98 pages. And also the podcast interview that he did in order to kind of explain or entice people to read it. That is about an hour, and he really does cover a lot of the ground that he covers in the book within the podcast. He at least gives a good introduction to it. Yeah, he's a very, very good teacher in that way, and kind of primes you for wanting to know more about the material that he wants to discuss and further. And the book really is a very quick read. It can be. It's not a page turner, but it's written in a way that really does make you want to know, what happens next. And maybe that's just me, but I read the book long before I considered taking a course with Fred Schaeffer, and I'm now certainly glad that I did. And so, one thing I want to do in this lecture video is just introduce you to what these concepts are, or at least what they are on the surface, and for more detail, I would really refer you to his interview and his book. But just to begin, this is an exercise in concept elucidation. The whole book is concept elucidation. So all of these smaller concepts are really aspects of elucidation. So what is elucidation? So if you break it down into its constituent parts, elucidation, to elucidate, lucid, if you've heard that word before, is clarity, to make clearer, or to make clear. And so elucidate is to make clearer, and to make clearer social science concepts is something that Schaeffer sees as important to be able to conduct meaningful social science research. And maybe that's in a way why he's part of the interpretive methodologies group, and actually the chair of it, because his whole kind of mission is to make it more meaningfully clear to everyone what these concepts are in social science are actually getting at, and how they're arrived at, and what they do, once they get into the discourse that we all have about them, and all the different research avenues, statistical, interview-based, archive-based, like whatever you think of as research. He's trying to show that to find the concepts in research, it's really essential that you make them clearer, so that we all have a more meaningful conversation, so that we're not just all talking past each other, maybe. He doesn't say that, that's my, formulation. He says it, so I have an essay question, or a literature review question that I've written for you in this module. And the essay question is: explain the differences between the way positivists understand concept formation, why Schaeffer calls what they do, positivists do, reconstruction, concept reconstruction, and what his process called elucidation does instead, and use facets of elucidation, meaning, and that's just my word, facets just means parts, right? Parts of elucidation, these other words. Exposing, grounding, locating, ethics, experience near concepts to illustrate your point. I should kind of draw a little line around this, though. Reconstruction and formation are not parts of elucidation. They are opposed to elucidation, or rather, elucidation is opposed to them. Let me show you why. And elucidating, I'll put in its own category here. It's kind of the umbrella term. Okay. All right. So these are the kind of constituent parts of elucidation. Reconstruction and formation. So let's, first of all, concept formation is a whole kind of subset of social science, and it's one actually that Schaeffer was schooled in when he was at the University of California at Berkeley, is where he went to graduate school. And I say that because the people who are the most active today and have been the most active for a generation in social science concept formation in a positivist sense are the people that he learned from and went to school with at UC Berkeley. And one of them is David Collier. And David Collier is this positivist who basically has made it his work to attempt to give concept formation as much of a scientific universalist reach as possible. And he's definitely part of that project that interpretivists you've been introduced to already, that interpretivists see as, not maybe the most productive, because what Collier seems to do is to take a concept and to break it down into subtypes and subconcepts that can have hundreds of subtypes. And if that doesn't sound intimidating to you, that's because you haven't tried to break down a concept into subtypes before, which I have now this summer, and that's a very strange, intimidating, and frustrating thing to do. But Collier and his co-authors, a lot of times his graduate students, have broken down categories like democracy into several hundred different subtypes of democracy in order to keep it as a cohesive concept. But that's part of what Schaeffer is saying is maybe the problem. In concept formation, what social scientists are doing, like Collier and like John Gehring, who is apparently a friend or something, and he has a quote, a blurb on the back of Schaeffer's book calling Schaeffer a very clear thinker. And I know the work of John Gehring from my own grad school experience, and full disclosure, I attended the same grad school, UMass, where Fred Schaeffer apparently is faculty, and we never met, but we were there at the same time. But anyway, but the point is that Gehring and Collier kind of see Schaeffer as a very clear thinker, and they see that he brings up a lot of maybe valid criticism, but they maybe disagree with the kind of fundamental place from which he addresses it. Concept formation is what is done almost all the time in social science work. And in social science work, in order to be able to measure anything, okay, to measure a concept like democracy is a good example, you have to be able to define what it is you're talking about when you say democracy. So does everybody have the same, from jump, does everybody have the same definition of the word or the concept of democracy? No. I mean, that's just from my own observations and my life, just walking through the world as someone who, people say, what do you do? I say I work in political science. And, within 60 seconds, you've got opinions people are throwing at you. about politics or about basic concepts, and uh, democracy is certainly one of them. And people say all kinds of different things about democracy. They say it's democracy is rule of the people. Democracy is rule of the mob. Well, there's a movie called Gladiator that I used to call good, but I think I haven't seen it in a long time, so I'm not really comfortable saying that anymore. But I saw it as a teenager, I think. So just they said the mob is Rome, was in that movie. So the idea that politicians kind of cater to the masses is one way to think of democracy. Another way to think of democracy is the modern understanding of a liberal democracy. Another is democracy just voting and electing people to act in your stead, to act in your interest, or is democracy something that is kind of lived in everyday life? Like, is there democracy in your home? Does everyone get an equal say, and is equality really part of it, or is it just kind of a measured ability to participate? Some kind of a proportioned out ability to participate and make decisions, or is it just a form of government, and is it just something that we shouldn't pay that much attention to, or is it just the opposite of anything that is a dictatorship or authoritarianism? Or is democracy no government? There's some people, kind of the anarchist or libertarian variety, who might say that democracy is just ruled by the people directly. Participatory democracy, everyone gets a say. So and anything less than that, where you just send other people to act in your stead, is by definition not democracy, by their definition. So everybody has different ways of looking at this concept of democracy, but what's done in social science in order to measure, for example, how democratic are all of the countries in XYZ region? How, and we'll just take Europe, how democratic are the various nation states of Europe? Let's try to create a scale. Well, you can't try to create a scale until you agree on the scale of, until you agree on the basic values of what a democracy is. And those values can be, how free is the press? You've heard all this before, like how free is the press? How often are elections? How much is there a right to speak out and a right to assemble? The kind of First Amendment rights that we hear about and apparently live under in the U.S. Our political parties banned? Is state TV, a monopoly? I don't know. So all of these different things, like you could just create a scale to answer yes or no to all of these things and give a score. But you have to agree that democracy is your definition then of democracy is a concept that you have formed, and it has these 100 features. Okay, it has, democracy is this and only this. It has 100 features, and the less something adheres to these 100 features, the less we can call it democracy. And so then you can come out with, all of the countries in Europe, however you define Europe, which is a whole other issue. Let's say it's 40 countries in Europe, and of those 40 countries, 30 of them have a score of 75 or higher, right, in democracy. And then the ones that don't, those 10 that don't, are called, because you have formed them, that democracy in that way, those 10 are, by your definition, not democratic. The problem becomes, what if they have democratic aspects to them? And what if, the countries that passed the test, as it were, who got 75% or higher on your test, what if a lot of them have really strong anti-democratic features, in that kind of 25%, and maybe there are aspects of that society, geographic or political, that really function in a way that is extremely authoritarian. Um, so there's a lot of gray area there, and what you've done by blocking off the democratic from the undemocratic is that you have created these categories that are not only limiting in terms of your analysis, but you also are creating this kind of falsehood in a lot of places in both the supposedly democratic and the supposedly undemocratic nation states. And so really the only thing that concept formation does is distort. And because they're calling it concept formation, that you have to create a concept and you have to create, for the purposes of this study, democracy will be defined as freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of political parties, frequent elections, frequent turnover of legislators or executive. Okay. All of that, equality between the branches and different levels of government, whatever. So it's defined that way. But what if it doesn't include certain definitions of democracy, like the ones I was talking about earlier, about participatory or direct democracy? And then a lot of people disagree with that concept. And so, it really rings hollow when they read something that says, these countries are more democratic and these countries are less democratic. Because it doesn't matter, if it doesn't actually adhere to what is the ordinary usage of the word democracy. It's just this kind of academic, exercise, like academic meaning in the worst sense. The academic, if just for the purposes of this one thought experiment in a published social science paper that nobody's ever going to read, right? It's academic. So, okay, yes, one's democratic and one's not. Big deal. So, Schaeffer has taken to calling concept formation concept reconstruction. And he thinks of it as, I think actually others have called it this. I'm not sure if he originated it or someone else did. Doesn't matter. But he says that it's useful to think of it as carpentry. Instead of, they're not building a house, right? The democracy is not a house in this example, or it's not a new house that they're building. They're renovating the house. They're taking an existing house of democracy, or maybe it's better for the thought experiment here to call it a property. It's a place or a property, and you are totally reconfiguring it for your own purposes. Okay, you're taking a hammer and nail, and you're boarding up windows, and you're building new walls, you're knocking down other walls, all for the purposes of like making it fit the way that you want it to work. So that's why he calls it reconstruction instead of formation. So it's weird. Like, he's giving it his own name, sort of, and I'm sure no one who practices concept formation and takes it seriously as a positivist appreciates that. I'm sure they really don't like it. But he says that it's a more accurate way to look at what they're doing, because they're not forming concepts. They are reconstructing concepts. They're taking them and making them in the way that is useful to them. So they're not beginning them. They're not taking them out of their minds and fully formed. And they're not dreaming up new words. They're taking existing words and giving them new definitions. And they're new. They try to be faithful, right, to what they see, and make it more. Make it more precise, but even if they make it more precise, they're not making it more accurate. So, so he calls concept formation and reconstruction the same thing. So elucidating is something different. I see that I'm running out of time here, which I didn't think I would. But let me talk about these words, and I'm going to let Fred Schaefer talk about them the most. I just really wanted to kind of bring you down this path for the most part of what these relationships between these are. Grounding is the idea of finding out how a concept really is used. Okay, not trying to make a box around it, but in trying to sort of tease out the meanings of the different ways in which the word is used. And you do that by several methods, but by talking to people, by reading archives, by just talking to people on the ground in the population as much as you can find a population that's using, this concept like democracy, so grounding, you do that kind of interviewing to see whether a concept like that, Fred Schaefer went to Senegal and the Philippines to see, how do they define democracy, and do they define it differently than each other and from the way that the U.S. defines it. So grounding is finding how people ordinarily use language and use a concept. Locating it is seeing when and where that concept is used. Exposing, and maybe where it got a new definition, actually. Locating is also part of locating is finding a new avenue to see how a concept has developed. Exposing is, and I realize I have this written out in my lecture notes twice now. Exposing is kind of exposing to your reader, and within the project to hopefully people who read it, the proximity to power, and how the power dynamics have affected and been affected by perhaps the concept that you're using. So that's what makes it political, is that concepts like democracy, or other words you can think of, republicanism, democratic, I don't know, I'm drawing a blank right now, just elections, all of those things are concepts, and you're exposing how much the word election has or vote has evolved over time, and how different political players have used the concept to their own ends, perhaps, and how it's been changed or stayed the same over time. The ethics of exposing, whether how things have developed, and by doing something like a genealogy, which I'll talk about in other lectures, is questionable, because if you're exposing, you're kind of exposing up. You're exposing to the world how powerful political actors have manipulated a concept. That's one thing. But if you are, but if on the other side of it, really, if you're exposing vulnerable people, in the sense of how they have negotiated with powerful political actors or powerful political concepts, then it's ethically questionable, whether you're to expose a vulnerable population to danger is something that concepts, after you talk to people, especially vulnerable people, about the way they use concepts. Like, for example, a homeless population was exposed by one researcher to the police about where their flops were, where they were sleeping at night, in I believe Seattle, and in Skid Row, and he talks about this in the book and in the interview, and how the police actually read this one scholar's work and went and busted up all these encampments, these flops, and so the ethics of doing that is certainly problematic. So you want to at least take that into account when you're doing this kind of work. Is what's the purpose of talking to a vulnerable population? Is it going to make them more vulnerable for them to talk to you? And experience near versus experience distant. Very quickly, I'll just say that this is experience near. The concept is a kind of ordinary usage of language, and and concepts that you would hear, words that you would hear, language you would hear in an ordinary everyday sense is an experience near concept. An experience distant concept is more like what an expert would use. Something that, different experts talking to each other, that's the reason they use experience distant concepts. Whereas, some concepts might use the word arcane. They might seem, meaningless to other people, and they only matter to the experts talking in a particular field. But they use them so that they can communicate with each other effectively, and I don't know, parsimoniously, in a quick, easy way. And finally, I'll mention it more in lecture 2, but Schaefer gets a lot of his ideas about ordinary language and ordinary language interviewing from Wittgenstein, who talked about language being a game. And, I think I'm going to let him explain that rather than try to have me explain that. But anyway, so that's kind of the basics, really, of what elucidation is and where it fits in social science and social science concepts. So I hope this was elucidating to you. And if it wasn't, I don't know, write a comment in the comment section. It is YouTube after all. Or, just ask me in class or send me an email is fine too. Okay, see you in lecture 2.